think most people would. I think most people won't say the 10 spies stopped believing in God. They probably still believed in God. Don't you think so? You're right. I don't think they stopped believing in God. They just stopped letting what they believed about God to be the loudest thing in the room. There's a difference between believing in God and allowing your belief in God to govern how you interpret your circumstances. Faithful vision is the second one. It's not just, yes, I believe God exists. It's, I am going to let what I know about God shape what I see. I'm going to let it shape what I say. I'm going to let it shape what I do, even when what's in front of me is screaming something else, something completely different. Last episode, we talked about vision, the difference between eyesight and vision, and we landed on this definition. Faithful vision recognizes reality while refusing to allow reality to redefine God. Maybe that landed for you. Maybe you wrote it down. Maybe you sat with that reflection question and got honest about a few things. That sounds good. But what does it actually look like in real life? What does it really look like on a day-to-day basis? Because it's one thing to say, don't let the giants redefine God. It's another thing entirely to stand in front of a giant and actually do what is required. So today we get practical. If you're just joining us, welcome to Align Podcast. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to episode 1. We laid the foundation, and on this episode, we'll be building on that foundation. This episode is called Seeing with God, Not Around Giants. And the question we're answering on this episode is this: how do you face real giants without denying they exist or without letting them shrink God? Because we know we all face giants every day. On one side, you have people who pretend the giants aren't there. That's not faith, that's denial. And on the other side, you have people who are so overwhelmed by the giants that they barely see God. God doesn't even register for them anymore. And that's not realism. That's fear dressed up as wisdom. Faithful vision lives somewhere else entirely. And on this episode, let's find out together. We're staying in the same passage on this episode, Numbers chapter 14, verses 7 to 9. Reading from the New King James Version. Joshua and Caleb, while speaking to the entire nation of Israel, they say this: the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. I want you to notice something before we get into this conversation on this episode. Joshua and Caleb did not say the giants aren't real. They did not say the cities aren't fortified. They did not say you're all being dramatic. There's nothing to worry about. What they did say is, the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. They acknowledged the situation, and then they anchored everything in the character and the presence of God. That is faithful vision. That is what it looks like in action. And on this episode, we're going to take it apart piece by piece. So I want to start this episode by going deeper on the word faithful, because I think we use that word so often in Christian circles that it loses its weight. The dictionary defines faithful in 4 ways. First, steadfast in affection or allegiance, loyal. Second, firm in adherence to promise or in observance of duty, conscientious. Third, giving with strong assurance, binding. And fourth, true to the fact, to a standard, or to an original. Now, this is where it gets really good. If faithful means loyal, then faithful vision is vision that stays loyal to God's word when everything around you is trying to make you defect, to God's character when everything else doesn't make sense. If faithful means conscientious, then faithful vision is vision that keeps showing up, keeps doing its duties, keeps speaking truth, even when it is unpopular. If faithful means binding, then faithful vision treats God's promises as a binding agreement, not as a suggestion or not as a maybe, a binding word from a God who does not go back on what he says. And if faithful means true to the fact, to the original, then faithful vision refuses to reinterpret what God originally said through the lens of what our present circumstance is. Wow. So when you put all four of those together, what do you get? You get Joshua and Caleb. They were loyal to God's word when fear was trying to pull the entire nation away. They were conscientious. They spoke truth to an entire nation that did not seem to want to hear it at that time. They treated God's promise as binding, non-negotiable, not reversible, and they stayed true to the original, what God said and what God is saying. Period. And the 10 spies did the opposite of everything. Every single one of those, they did the opposite of those. On every single one, they defected from loyalty. They abandoned their duty to speak truth. They treated God's promise as negotiable once the circumstances felt threatening. They rewrote the original. They took what God said and ran it through the filter of fear until basically it became unrecognizable. When you say it this way, I think most people won't say the 10 spies stopped believing in God. They probably still believed in God. Don't you think so? You're right. I don't think they stopped believing in God. They just stopped letting what they believed about God to be the loudest thing in the room. There's a difference between believing in God and allowing your belief in God to govern how you interpret your circumstances. Faithful vision is the second one. It's not just, yes, I believe God exists. It's, I am going to let what I know about God shape what I see. I'm going to let it shape what I say. I'm going to let it shape what I do, even when what's in front of me is screaming something else, something completely different. Well, that definitely requires a lot of intentionality. It does. See, the book I drew this season from says something that I want you to hear. It says having a faithful vision is not automatic. It requires intentional effort, focus on God, and a determination to not rebel or be ruled by fear. Not automatic. It has to be cultivated. It has to be chosen, which means every single day is an opportunity to either strengthen your vision or continue to let it erode. I do have a question though. So let's get really practical here, because I think people here cultivate your vision and they're not sure what that means in real life. What did faithful vision actually change about Joshua and Caleb? Did it change how they operated, or what is a very concrete example of what they experienced? Let me give you 4 things directly from their story. The first one is this: where others learned to lean on their own understanding, Joshua and Caleb trusted God's character. Please break that down. Okay, so the 10 spies looked at the giants and ran a calculation: our strength versus their strength, our walls versus their walls, our math versus theirs. And the math did not work in their favor, so they concluded, we cannot do this. That is leaning on your own understanding. You take the visible data and run it through your own analysis, and you make a decision based on that for your own reasoning. And here's what you produce. Just like the 10 spies, Joshua and Caleb looked at the same giants and ran the same analysis through a different calculation entirely. Not our strength versus their strength, but God's faithfulness versus the size of the obstacle. And the math always works out. So it's not that they ignored the data, they just added the most important variable. Exactly. They didn't pretend the giants weren't large. They just refused to leave God out of the equation. Okay, I hear you. What's the second thing? Where the others imagined defeat, Joshua and Caleb foresaw victory. Now that sounds like positive thinking again. I hear you, but here's the difference. Positive thinking says I'm going to imagine a good outcome because optimism helps. Faithful vision says I'm going to align my imagination with what God has already declared. God said this land is ours, so I'm not imagining victory. I am agreeing with a promise that has already been made. So it's not about conjuring up a good mental image. It's about bringing your imagination into alignment with God's word. Exactly. The 10 spies let their imagination run them towards the wrong direction, right? They imagined defeat before they even fought a single battle. Joshua and Caleb's imagination was governed by the promise. God said we would have this land. So they saw themselves having it, not because they were optimistic, but because they were obedient to what God had already spoken. Okay. What's the third thing? Where the others rebelled, Joshua and Caleb submitted. It's a subtle thing, but it's really important. What do you mean by submitted? When the nation decided to rebel, right, that's harsh. I don't think I'll call it full-blown rebellion. Well, see, when you choose something else other than what God has said, when you let fear become so loud that people start talking about stoning Moses and going back to Egypt, that is rebellion against what God has already said. Joshua and Caleb didn't go with the crowd. Staying loyal to God's word and God's character in that moment when the entire nation was moving in the opposite direction, that required a deep, settled submission to the authority of God's word over the authority of the majority opinion at that particular time. That's a hard place to stand. It is one of the hardest things to do because it's one thing to trust God when you're alone. It's another thing entirely to trust God when an entire community is moving the other way and they're calling you the unreasonable one. Joshua and Caleb stood there, just the two of them, against the whole nation of Israel, and they did not move because their allegiance was to God's word, not to the consensus, right? Their allegiance was to God. Their allegiance to God actually governed their perception, and their perception governed their response. That's the fourth thing, and it's the summary of all of these things. Faithful vision does not just change what you see. It changes what you do. Say more about that because I believe it's deeper than that. Okay, I'll say it this way. So the 10 spies, they saw giants and they retreated in fear. Joshua and Caleb saw the same giant and they advanced in faith. Same circumstances, completely different responses. The difference wasn't courage, or at least courage wasn't the starting point. The starting point was vision. What they believed about God. That in itself determined what they saw. What they saw determined what they were willing to do to step into that promise. This is why the battle over your vision is not a secondary battle. It is the primary battle because whoever wins the vision wins everything downstream. If fear wins your vision, fear wins your direction. Fear wins your decision, fear wins your destiny. But if God's faithfulness wins your vision, then faith governs your direction, faith governs your decision, faith governs your destiny. So faithful vision does not deny the presence of giants. It refuses to let the giants redefine God. That is it. Obstacles are temporary. God's promises are certain, and God's presence is decisive. Write those three things down. Number one, obstacles are temporary. God's promises are certain, and God's presence is decisive. I want to ask you something that I think a lot of people are actually wrestling with, but maybe they haven't put it into words yet. What happens when you've been trying to hold faithful vision and it still hasn't worked out? Like, What do you do? What do you say to someone who's been holding the promises, choosing faith over fear, doing the right things, and the outcome still hasn't come? That's a real life question, and I want to be honest. The honest answer is faithful vision is not a formula that produces the outcome you want on the timeline you want. It is a posture. It is a way of orienting yourself towards God, regardless of what you can currently see. And the evidence for that is Joshua and Caleb themselves, because here is something we have to see to it. They held faithful vision. They spoke the right report. They submitted when others rebelled. And they still spent 40 years in the wilderness. And that's not the version of the story people usually tell, though. No, it's not. And I think that's a disservice to people who are genuinely suffering in a season of delay. Joshua and Caleb did not get an immediate reward to their faithfulness. They got 40 years of watching the generation around them die in the wilderness. They wandered in the same desert. They ate the same manna, slept under the same sky. The difference is not that faithful vision fast-tracked their blessing. The difference is what happened inside them during those 40 years, which was their conviction deepened instead of eroding. The 10 spies, for instance, or the generation that followed their report, their unbelief produced bitterness, wandering, and ultimately death before the promise. But Caleb, 40 years in the same wilderness, comes out on the other side, and he comes out more settled, more convicted, more ready to take the mountain that was even there from the first time he saw it. So faithful vision doesn't protect you from the wilderness, but it determines what the wilderness does to you. That's beautifully put. The wilderness either erodes you or it refines you. And the determining factor is that the vision you carry into it. If you carry fear into the wilderness will amplify the fear. If you carry faithful vision into the wilderness will deepen your faith. I'll say one more thing about this, about faithful vision. Faithful vision is not something you perform for God so that He rewards you. It is something you choose for yourself, because the alternative is a life where your circumstances are always the loudest voice in the room. And that is an exhausting way to live. To wake up every morning and you have to negotiate your fears before you can even take a single step. Faithful vision says, I've already decided. God said it. I believe it. The giants don't get a vote. Let me bring this home. Maybe you've been doing the right things, praying, declaring, going to church, trusting God, and the things you're believing for still hasn't moved. And somewhere in the waiting, a quiet lie has started to take hold. The lie that says maybe faithful vision works for others, but not for you. Maybe it worked for Joshua and Caleb, but not for you. My situation is different. My giants are bigger. My delay is longer. Maybe God's promises don't quite reach where I am. I need you to hear me on this. That lie is the voice of the 10 spies. It has been wrong every single time it has been believed. The promise God made over your life is not contingent on how long you've been waiting. It is not diminished by how large your giants appear. It is not weakened by how many people around you have given up on it. God's word does not expire. Faithful vision does not negate the reality of difficulty, but it holds on to the faithfulness, the loyalty, the truthfulness, and the strong assurance found in the person of God and the weight of His word. That's what you're choosing when you choose faithful vision. You're not choosing to pretend, you are choosing to anchor. And the anchor holds when the storm is loud. So, here's your reflection question. Where have I let a giant redefine God instead of letting God redefine the giant? Be specific. Name the giant and then write it down. What has God actually said about this situation? Because when vision is faithful, obedience becomes possible. Courage becomes natural, and the promises of God move from distant hope to a lived out reality. That is episode 2, Saying with God, Not Around Giants. If this episode met you somewhere real, share it with someone. You already know who comes to mind. On the next episode, we'll be moving into what I call manual override. We're going to talk about what happens when life pulls you off course and how to deliberately engage manual override, a reset back to God's character, God's word, and God's promises. Until next time, cheers.